So why does the calories in, calories out not work? Because I think this is a really important conversation, especially now. A lot of people in the UK are getting into things like high rocks and they're doing a lot more weightlifting and they're kind of getting into that more stronger mindset. But I still think the conversation around nutrition for women is not clear. And I do still think that the calorie conversation is still such a big thing where people are tracking what they're eating, the calories that they're having. And I do remember even 5 years ago, there was a 500-day calorie limit that a lot of my peers were going on to help lose weight. There was one, I don't know, 10 years ago, the Special K diet, where you would eat two
Oh
bowls of
yeah,
cereal. Do you remember? And I
I
still think
remember.
these things are still there, um, but in just a slightly different context. So let's like divulge, like, why is it not calories in, calories out? Why is that not good for our health?
Yeah, well, when we look at it, and I take it from the view of women, right? We look at it. Women have two areas in the hypothalamus that are super sensitive to nutrient density. One controls our endocrine system, and the other one is more appetite control and immunity. So when we start trying to do calories in, calories out, we see that within 4 days of a low energy availability, you start to have a downturn of your thyroid and a flattening of your luteinizing hormone pulse. And we need to have our hormones pulsing in a certain fashion because we have a 24-hour circadian rhythm, but it's also from a cellular matrix as well as a whole body system. So when you start having interruptions to these pulses, you start having cellular disruption. So we start to see this early on in women. And the way that I point to it is if we're looking at how many like baseline calories of good quality food that a woman needs in order just to maintain basic endocrine health, we're seeing that you have a perturbance starting at 35 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, but for men it's 15. So right there, if a man isn't eating as much, then he's going to lean up and get fitter and faster. When we see women who are delaying and not eating enough, they put on belly fat. They get a lot of disruption in the signaling for mitochondrial uptake of free fatty acids. So we start to have more what we call esterified fats floating around. And these esterified fats are a change in the molecular shape, I guess is the best way to put it, from a free fatty acid. So it can't get pulled in to the skeletal muscle and the mitochondria. It goes to the liver, and the liver is like, hey, I know what to do with this. I'm going to bind it up and store it as visceral fat, right? And the simple thing to break that chain is to have enough food, especially protein. So, we've come from the whole conversations of low fat, high carb, or low carb, high fat, right? No one's ever talked about protein. But the more research that's coming out about protein, the more we're seeing it is so incredibly important for women to get at least 1.6 grams per kilo of body weight per day. And this is even if you're just recreationally active. But then when you start seeing people who are training for high rocks, right? And the high, like I've been seeing the reels and things of people who are training for the first high rocks. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you are not eating enough and you're training too much. And it's a direct, like people used to call it overtraining. People then moved on to adrenal fatigue, but it's basically you're not giving your body enough food. You're not eating enough to maintain health. And I think this is where that whole like fasting thing comes in too, because people are now using it as an excuse to delay intake and have calorie restriction under a socially okay meme of how they're eating. Because, back in the 80s or even the 70s, if you said you were fasting, people would think that you belonged in the hate in San Francisco as part of the hippie tribe, right? But now it's socially acceptable.
Similar
So,
to
yeah,
yoga. If that was you
exactly.
40 years ago, you belonged in a hippie tribe. I really want to bring up that 1.6 grams per kilo, because just to put this into context for people that might not know where that sits with our recommendations, I'll talk about this from the UK because I'm not sure about America. But it's 0.75 grams per kilo of body weight is what we're recommended in the UK for women right now. So
That's
that's like
so
the
low.
base, that's like the level. That's not the baseline. That's like the recommended daily kind of, so it's around 45 grams, I'd say, for like the average woman, which I just wanted to like put into context of what you're saying, which is 1.6. You're literally doubling it for the
Hmm.
minimum. So
Right.
that's the conversation that I think we need to be having, right? That you're talking about. Whereas like it's our public health guidelines at the moment that are, I guess, how we're looking in the UK, the Eat Well plate, right? It's quite
Hmm.
small on the protein. And if I'm thinking about the pyramid in America, again, the protein emphasis isn't
Small.
big. So how let's redefine it, Stacey. Let's
Yeah.
redefine a woman's. Can you not do this? Can you not build the woman's plate, the eat well plate for a woman?
Yeah, because like I don't think people realize that regardless of what country you're in, the recommended daily allowance or recommended daily intake is based on the minimal amount to avoid malnutrition. And the recommended intake for protein for women has been based on sedentary older men and really poor nitrogen studies. And
Didn't
they
mean to
use
laugh then,
sedentary
but
no, I mean, it's funny, right? Because they're like, well, women don't want to go through nitrogen studies. They're delicate flowers. So we'll look at someone who has similar body composition. So we'll look at these older men who have higher body fat than younger men. How much do they need? Oh, well, that's what it's going to be for women. And that's how we've gotten these recommended daily intakes, right? And no one's gone back to look at it. Recently, they're starting to really look at protein and how important it is because we're starting to see I laugh at the irony of the fact that the whole world is malnourished. We have malnourishment from lack of food, and we have malnourishment of too many processed calories and shit food.
so I always say overnourished and undernourished at the same time.
Yeah.
We're
Yep.
overweight, but we're nutrient deprived.
Exactly. Exactly. That's it, right? And I find it interesting being an expat when I'm in New Zealand and I see the food that's available here versus I go to the States and I'll go to a grocery store in the States and there's rows and rows and rows of stuff they say is food, but I couldn't eat any of it because it's so ultra processed and just marketed with a whole bunch of stuff. And if you're not aware of that, you don't know how to choose. So I think that if we're going to look at a plate, like what is a woman's ideal plate, there needs to be the caveat of if it has big marketing that says high protein and it's a Pop Tart, move away, right? This is what ultra processed food means. But generally, I mean, it's the old fashioned 30-40-40 rule where 30% is protein, 30% is good fats, and 40% is complex carbs. And then you modify based on like who you are with regards to where you are in your lifespan, what kind of training you're doing, if you're traveling or not under high stress. Because if you're under a lot of high stress, you need to boost some carbs up just to keep your gut microbiome happy and to be able to have immune cells that are happy. So yeah, there's the little nuances within that, but basically that old fashioned 40-30-30 is really good. And then it's the distribution throughout the day that people need to nail. We're looking at, having food when you wake up and having regular protein throughout the day and really good complex carbs. And we can go to the 80-20 rule where 80% you're doing that and 20% is life. But people put so many restrictive rules around what they're eating that they forget what it means to be nourished from a soul perspective, not just a physicality.
Hmm. Well, I mean, that's something that I dial in on my work a lot, especially if you also look at, work from Stanford with Aaliyah Crum, when she talks about, you could have the same meal, but your mindset, if you're told that you've got the FTO gene, which is the one that you're more predetermined to be obesogenic, which actually is a very small chance, by the way, that if you do have that, but
Yep.
never again, that's the information how they delivered it in the study, that if you have that same meal and you're either told that you have that gene or you don't, you will metabolize that meal totally differently. And I think that for me was really striking in the work that I've gone on to do with nutrition, that yes, food is so fundamental, but it's not always just food is first, because the mindset plays a massive factor in how we're thinking about this, how we're choosing it, how we actually accept ourselves. Are we making the right decisions for us or because we're told that we should? And we're being misdirected in our health goals. And that I believe that's like one of the most underestimated conversations, especially for women, because we've spoken so much about that cultural influence of the pressures that we have. And many women might say, well, maybe I don't feel that, but I think subconsciously we all have that messaging because that's what we've grown up in.
Yeah, it is. And the push to take care of everyone else first
Oh,
instead of
yeah.
us, right? And
The
I'm
mother.
always telling, yeah, the mother, even if you're not a mother, you're still thinking about work or your partner or your parents. And I'm always like, you got to take at least 10 minutes first thing in the morning just to center yourself and say, what am I doing for myself today? and make it a like a permanent note in your calendar so it can't be moved.